John, when you're with a pupil, and you take teaching very seriously, I know, what are you trying to do?
Well, of course, in part that depends upon the student that I'm facing.
Hmm.
You know, I, as a boy, with uh, my dad was called up to active duty in Europe, and we lived in New York City, just a few blocks from the Bronx Zoo. And I had my grandfather lived upstairs, and my dad and my grandfather worked on art together. Suddenly, and I was surrounded by these eccentric little old Neapolitan men and women. Now, my mother was a Scotch-Irish farm girl who was adventurous and loved art, and they had a wonderful marriage. By the way, that was called a mixed marriage back then. She was Presbyterian and Dad was a Roman Catholic. I think we've opened up that, but I think the thing we ignore is that it was a real incredible reach between these two cultures, and the most harmonious thing. I still marvel at it. Well, at any rate, my mom had the passion for music, my dad for art. Suddenly, during the Berlin crisis, we were in a little village in Germany, and every summer we'd go to Italy, and my grandfather would meet us there. And my grandpa was one of these people that would take the boat or the plane, and he'd go back every couple of years. Bella Napoli, 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 Napoli. Suddenly, there we were. And my dad took my hand when I was 7, and we walked the streets of Pompeii. And I'd go from one hill, we'd drive through the hills of Germany, and I'd see a ruined castle on the hill. And then I got to room with my grandfather in these little inns. I was with Grandpa. I adored my grandfather, one of the sweetest men ever. Sounded more like Chico Marx than he spoke the most delightfully. He was actually quite well read, but he would talk to me about art. Tomorrow we're going to see the Pietà. I didn't understand 80% of what he was saying. I just loved that he was telling it to me.
Yeah.
And it was clear to me that Michelangelo and Raphael, he said, Michelangelo, he was good at this. Raphael, he was good at that. And I would just listen. But what was clear was that these men who had lived and died 500 years before him was real to him as my grandfather was living upstairs.
Absolutely.
Now, I didn't inherit that, but my father and grandfather very much lived in this communion, the artistic version of the communion of saints. And the biggest thing I try to communicate, I can't help it, is this idea of the communion of art.
It's wonderful. Wonderful.
And I have to see this as something. Now, my tradition goes back 200 years. When I sit down and I, so to speak, sculpt a reed, it has a feel, it has a sound. It is something that's uniquely qualified to enable me to shape things the way for 200 years people of my school of playing have done. It's like a dialect. In fact, my father and grandfather spoke in an antique dialect of Neapolitan, a language of its own. I remember my father coming home in the 1980s or 90s and saying his last cousin that he could speak Neapolitan to had passed away. This longing for this, to keep this language alive. Now, I don't know if I don't hope I haven't gone down a rat hole by saying these things, but part of the thing that is just, it's the only way I can look at my faith. It's the only way I can look at my art, is this intense need to take this, make this thing live. Now, it's a French tradition, and that means the French were hyper-rationalists. They like to describe things, in fact, in numbers and principles, and yet it's bonded to the heart. So in the end, if you can come through this and do things as paint by numbers, but there's a beauty about the way they shape and the way they look at the structure of things that, if bonded to the heart, has a power for me. It speaks to me. I've got to make those kids yearn for that.
That's wonderful.
Now,
Wonderful.
what I say to each individual, some of them have a very strong faith tradition, and I can make parallels that way, but I have
Yeah,
to be very,
of course.
very, very careful about that.
Of course. But the idea, I mean, that with me, I can remember a brilliant piano teacher I had. Now that you put it that way, I never thought about that before. And he was a very, very committed Roman Catholic. But he was really saying, do you realize when you're playing this, you are joining a very large community of the living and the dead or passed on.
And could
And
I
that community, and
say,
he,
Jeremy, with that, could I
it's
say
very,
with that, the social aspect that Elizabeth was describing,
yes,
this idea of reading signals,
yeah,
what this has reinforced is the profound social aspect of it. And by the way, it includes socializing with those long passed away composers.
I
They're
know,
particularly the ones you've played, Mr. Bach, Mr. Beethoven, and to feed again in with something Elizabeth said, the disappointment. If you've actually touched a performance, or suddenly Eroica or Brahms' second, the Brahms Requiem, whatever, is suddenly alive and you're immersed in it.
I know.
The bitter I don't want to disappoint Mr. Brahms. I don't want to disappoint Mr. Bach. Yes, I don't want to make a mistake, but if it's less beautiful than that thing that they showed me, it's this, it becomes suffused with disappointment to me.
That's fantastic. Thank you for that.